Do you find you've got very little to show after your songwriting sessions? Do you look on the floor and see a sort of sea of scattered paper balls, the results of all your ideas being thrown out? Do you find your songwriting sessions are filled with an internal battle where you seem to be fighting against yourself and throwing out all your ideas? If so, then this is the video for you. My name is Rebecca and welcome to the Songwriter's Compass, helping you to explore your songwriting abilities and find your voice. In today's video, we are going to look at the inner critic. What is our inner critic? How does it relate to songwriting? And how can we deal with it? A little personal backstory for you. When I first started seriously writing songs, I went on a songwriting retreat with a view to getting better at writing songs, getting better at chords, melody, lyrics. And what I found was that the one thing that was stopping me from progressing with songwriting was actually the battle with my inner critic. And the other thing I learned on that songwriting retreat was that every other person on the retreat was suffering with the same problem. So what is our inner critic? Because I think this really leads to a lot of clues as to how we can actually deal with it. Way back when, I used to study evolutionary psychology as part of my degree. And evolutionary psychology is basically the premise that not only did our bodies evolve through natural selection, but our minds and our behaviours. So what purpose does our inner critic serve as a hunter-gatherer? So if we think about Stone Age times, perhaps, we're thinking about cooking a meal and we're looking on the forest floor and we see a tasty looking mushroom, but our inner critic says, I saw someone in the next village and he was really sick after he ate that mushroom, so I don't think that's a good idea. Right? So our inner critic really evolved to help us, to protect us. But obviously, since Stone Age times, our culture has evolved massively, but our evolutionary drives and mechanisms haven't. So what we're seeing is our inner critic is being inappropriately used in the context of songwriting, trying to protect us, but in effect, stopping us from being creative. So is there a place for our inner critic in songwriting at all? And I'd argue there absolutely is. So when you are sat down trying to work out which songs you want to put more money behind or more time behind, your inner critic is going to be absolutely essential to help you decipher which songs are going to go that mile and which songs aren't. Or perhaps you're going to submit some songs to a radio station or a music blog or even a music supervisor. And at that stage, your inner critic is going to be so valuable in helping you work out what the criteria is and whether your songs meet that criteria. But at the very inception stage of our ideas, when we start conceiving ideas, I'd argue that there is no place for your inner critic. Because I don't believe that creativity and criticism can coexist happily. So to sum up, I feel that our inner critic's completely useless at the creation stage, but is far more useful when we're coming to evaluate our songs at a later date. So how does that help us deal with our inner critic? So I've come up with 3 options for you to deal with your inner critic. And the first one is to ignore your inner critic. Now, I'm sure you've tried this because it seems like such an obvious option. And I don't know about you, but I have certainly found that my inner critic voice just seems to get louder because it's not being heard. And if it's there to protect and help us, it is going to get louder. So I don't think ignoring your inner critic is a very good strategy. So your second option is to argue with your inner critic. So come up with counter reasons as to why you should pursue your ideas. I've even come across songwriters who personify their inner critic, call them something like Evil Keith, to try and help them deal with their inner critic. But I find the more weight you give to your inner critic, again, the louder it becomes. And actually arguing with yourself is an incredible waste of energy. So I wouldn't recommend that you argue with your inner critic. So the third option, which is what I do to deal with my inner critic, is to make friends with your inner critic. And I think this makes sense when we think it's a part of ourselves that is there to help us and there to protect us. So trying to cut it off or silence it or personify it and argue with it is sort of counterintuitive. So how do you make friends with your inner critic? I want you to start entering into a measured dialogue with your inner critic. So, for example, you come up with the lyric, "The cat sat on the mat with a hat." Okay? Totally inspired and copyrighted, so please don't pinch it. And your inner critic immediately goes, "Oh, those lyrics are so cheesy." I want you to acknowledge your inner critic. So say, "Yep, I can see where you're coming from. It does sound a little cheesy." But then you can offer a more measured response like, "But you know, these are just placeholders. So I'm just going to keep those weird lyrics in at this stage until I come up with something a bit more inspired. But thank you for your input." Okay, it might seem a really long-winded way of dealing with your inner critic. And at first you might spend most of your hour, your hour of songwriting in dialogue with your inner critic. But what you will find is that your inner critic will start to get quieter and more measured and more balanced. I don't think your inner critic's ever going to disappear. You're never going to silence your inner critic. But by listening to your inner critic and offering a measured response, you're integrating that portion of yourself that's really just trying to protect you and help you. Let me know in the comments if this resonates with you and if you have any amazing tips to deal with your inner critic. I'd be so interested to hear them. I'm going to be releasing more songwriting tips on things like chords, melody, lyrics, and mindset. So please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out. And as always, happy songwriting.